Welcome to the Deep Dive. This week, we are undertaking a special analysis of the global stage. We'll be synthesizing a complex set of sources focusing on the diplomatic and political shifts centered around the United Nations General Assembly in New York this past week.
Indeed. The global conversation right now seems defined by a fundamental tension. It's this conflict between pursuing structured international diplomatic process versus, well, the rise of unilateral action.
And we see that tension playing out quite clearly.
Yes, from the shifting positions on Palestinian statehood right through to the speeches delivered at the 80th UNGA session in late September 2025. Our aim here is to cut through the noise, delivering the critical insights from these divergent global viewpoints directly to you.
We should mention that this deep dive is brought to you by ProWave AI. They utilize veteran intelligence systems for timely, multidimensional information processing.
And the analysis you're hearing now, synthesizing data streams across global news, policy papers, and even social media, is generated by Stylo News, the AI-powered news application.
Okay, let's unpack this first major area, the diplomatic shifts surrounding Palestine. Ahead of the UNGA, there was a clear, almost coordinated international wave building towards recognition of Palestinian statehood.
Yes, and sources suggest this isn't merely symbolic. It appears intended as a tactical move designed to increase pressure on Israel regarding ongoing military actions in Gaza.
We're talking about significant players moving on this. Australia, the United Kingdom, Canada, Portugal.
And the critical anticipation of action from France as well.
Right. But then there's the counterstance.
What's immediately important here is the key counterposition coming out of Europe, specifically from Germany. German Foreign Minister Johann Wadephul, speaking just days before the UNGA, reaffirmed Germany's long-held stance.
Which is?
That recognition cannot be a unilateral political step taken beforehand. It must be the culmination of a final negotiated two-state solution, process first.
That position forces Germany into a highly visible balancing act, doesn't it?
It certainly does. On one hand, they have this unwavering historical commitment to Israel's security. But on the other, the global and, importantly, domestic pressure regarding the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is escalating. We even have UN declarations of famine conditions.
So standing firm on process before recognition is their way to manage that internal conflict.
It seems so, but it does put them at odds with nearly every other major Western ally currently moving or signaling moves towards recognition.
And the perspectives from the key decision makers really highlight this strategic split.
Absolutely. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, predictably, condemned these unilateral recognitions, characterizing them as, quote, rewarding Hamas and terrorism.
While Germany, through Wadephul, frames its position as necessary for genuine long-term peace and security.
But then look at the view from Palestinian diplomats, as cited in Phoenix news sources. They welcome the recognition wave, naturally, but stress that these moves are, in their view, purely symbolic.
So recognition alone is insufficient.
Insufficient, yes. They are explicitly demanding concrete, non-symbolic measures. Things like sanctions against Israel or the suspension of trade agreements that specifically benefit Israeli settlements.
That difference, symbolic diplomacy versus calls for mandatory action, seems crucial.
It is. It shows the risk that the international community might satisfy its own diplomatic conscience, perhaps, without actually impacting the facts on the ground.
And locally in Germany, we see this playing out politically, too. Sources mention heightened public awareness, large pro-Palestinian rallies in Berlin. It reflects an internal push for Germany to potentially move beyond its traditional caution.
It's crucial to remember that this whole regional wave of diplomatic pressure really set the stage. Delegates arrived in New York already grappling with this tension between diplomatic shifts and these demands for tangible action.
Which must have immediately contributed to the atmosphere at the UNGA speeches themselves.
Exactly. It escalated quickly into the, well, rather charged atmosphere of the 80th UN General Assembly speeches on September 23rd. The stage was set for unilateral rhetoric to challenge the call for multilateral process.
And the speech that truly dominated the conversation, perhaps unexpectedly, was that of the U.S. president. President Trump's address lasted nearly an hour. That's about 4 times the typical allotted time.
Which itself is a diplomatic signal, isn't it? Demanding attention, disrupting the schedule.
Precisely. And sources indicate the atmosphere in the hall shifted from diplomatic severity to something more akin to political theater, marked by personal boasts and very specific, targeted criticisms.
The substance was highly focused, aimed, it seems, at fracturing certain international alignments. The president accused China and India directly of, in effect, funding the conflict in Ukraine by continuing to purchase Russian energy.
He wasn't just pointing fingers there. The insight seems to be that by linking energy purchases to conflict financing, he's trying to shift the geopolitical fault line away from just U.S. versus Russia towards a broader idea of, say, the economically responsible versus the irresponsible. That's a potent diplomatic angle against the BRICS nations.
It is, though certainly risky. He also criticized Europe's reliance on Russian energy, still a sensitive point, and explicitly rejected Palestinian state recognition, calling it a reward for Hamas.
But here's where the policy shift caused real diplomatic confusion, according to the reports. He endorsed Ukraine's right to reclaim all lost territories.
That's a significant reversal, isn't it?
It is. For the U.S. president to move from perhaps conditional support or implied acceptance of negotiated settlements to endorsing full territorial reclamation, what pressure does that put on NATO's strategy?
It creates immediate tension. While certainly welcomed by some European allies on the surface, it leaves major open questions about the coherence of U.S. foreign policy. Is the U.S. prepared to back that claim logistically, militarily, or is it primarily rhetoric? This internal contradiction was a major talking point among delegates, our sources suggest.
Now, contrast that rather lengthy and perhaps chaotic delivery with other key leaders at the assembly.
Yes. Turkish President Erdogan, for example, he delivered a very strong condemnation of Israel's actions in Gaza. This appeared calculated, attracting significant attendance, strong applause, maximizing his political influence, particularly within the Islamic world, by reiterating those calls for Palestinian state recognition.
Then you had leaders advocating for national autonomy in a different way.
Right. Brazilian President Lula condemned unilateral sanctions and foreign interference. Now, sources note he frames Brazil as a staunch defender of democracy, but one must often read such statements through the lens of national interest, meaning this condemnation of sanctions is often less about abstract global governance and more about protecting Brazil's own domestic trade interests, which sometimes align with countries facing Western sanctions.
Understood. Meanwhile, the Emir of Qatar, Sheikh Tamim, offered a sharp systemic critique.
He did, advocating for justice and transparency while specifically criticizing what he termed the erosion of international law and the dominance of power politics.
That criticism from Qatar, given their role as mediators, seems aimed squarely at unilateral actions bypassing the UN Security Council.
That's the likely interpretation. Actions like military interventions or sanctions conducted outside an explicit Security Council mandate. Qatar's role depends heavily on the stability of international law, so defending it is strategic for them.
And finally, French President Emmanuel Macron.
Macron advocated strongly for renewed effective multilateralism.
And to be clear, when Macron pushes for effective multilateralism, he's essentially calling for a system where the UN Security Council can actually enforce its resolutions, right? Not just be paralyzed by great power vetoes and self-interest.
That's precisely the implication. Unsurprisingly, international media like The Guardian framed the U.S. president's speech not just as eccentric, but as actively undermining global reliance on U.S. leadership, prompting explicit calls, in some quarters, for new, stable, multilateral alliances, perhaps less reliant on Washington. This assembly really underscored the UN's credibility challenge.
Okay, if we connect this to the bigger picture, for you, the listener, it's critical to see where there's agreement and where the core disputes really lie.
The common ground is actually quite broad, interestingly. The necessity of the two-state solution, in principle, is affirmed by the UN, Germany, France, among others. And there's universal, undeniable concern over the devastating humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza. No one disputes the severity.
But the source variance highlights the strategic deadlock, as you said earlier.
Exactly. Sources like CNA and UDN tend to emphasize diplomatic language, supporting traditional processes. They suggest patience, negotiation. Conversely, sources like Phoenix News, citing those Palestinian diplomats, explicitly demand non-symbolic action now.
Their argument being that waiting for a perfect process just allows the current situation to persist.
Precisely. Which is why sanctions and other concrete measures are their focus, rather than just diplomatic statements or recognitions alone.
So what does this all mean? When we look at public sentiment, what are people saying? We synthesize data from social media analysis, primarily focusing on the X platform, to gauge feelings around the themes discussed at the UNGA, particularly peace and security. The results are, well, quite stark.
Yes, the overall tone is overwhelmingly negative. Our analysis registered up to 70% negative sentiment related to those themes. This negativity seems directly linked to a deep public disillusionment with the UN's perceived failure to act decisively.
It's not necessarily frustration with the idea of diplomacy itself, though.
Apparently not entirely. The hashtag diplomacy actually garnered a slightly more optimistic view, suggesting people still value the concept of peaceful negotiation. The real criticism, the intense negativity, focuses on tangible action or the lack thereof. The hashtag military drew the most intense criticism.
Why specifically #military?
Due to perceived failures in global security and conflict resolution. The public sentiment, broadly speaking, seems to be, we support talking, but the talking isn't stopping the conflicts.
This aligns perfectly with the critiques we heard from leaders like the Emir of Qatar regarding power politics overriding international law.
Therefore, as we look ahead, there are 4 key continuing developments you should probably be watching closely over the next few weeks. First, the anticipated formal recognition of Palestine by France. That's the big diplomatic domino still poised to fall in this current wave.
Second, we need to monitor the specific policy measures or diplomatic responses from Israel. How will they react to counter this wave of international recognition? Will there be punitive measures against recognizing nations? Changes in settlement policy, we need to watch that closely.
Third, the practical implications of that U.S. policy shift on Ukraine. Will the U.S. actually provide the specific heavy armaments necessary for Kyiv to realistically pursue reclaiming all lost territories, as the president stated? Or will it remain largely rhetorical?
And fourth,
Keep a close watch on further Middle East negotiations, particularly those involving key players like Qatar and France regarding potential ceasefire arrangements and hostage releases. Those back-channel efforts often continue regardless of the public rhetoric on the UN floor.
now, just to reiterate our methodology here, this news brief was synthesized using the Stylo News AI engine. It processes vast amounts of data from numerous traditional news sources, alongside publicly available information from X, formerly Twitter, to generate these rapid, comprehensive analyses.
And for AI-powered, on-demand news briefs that can be tailored precisely to your specific intelligence needs, we certainly encourage you to subscribe to Stylo News.
Visit www.stylonews.com today. You can start a free trial there and gain immediate access to these global intelligence streams.
It's a powerful tool for staying informed.
Thank you for joining us for this special deep dive brief on the week's critical global developments.
We appreciate your dedication to staying fully informed and engaged with the complexities of our world.
Watch for more Stylo News reports, and please follow us on your favorite social media platforms.
Good day.